My parents have owned their shop, Antojos, for over 45 years. My maternal grandfather gifted the store to my mother when she and my father got married. They've been running the business ever since, employing some of our close relatives from time to time. It's a decently sized store, located on a busy street corner in our city. The outside has been repainted the same shade of green, with the pink stripes for decades. On the right side of the building, there's a large mural of a Katrina that faces the main road. You can usually find people posing outside the shop, using the mural as a backdrop for their Instagram photos. We recently got a new store sign done to replace the old faded one that was chipping. The new one is a lot better and was done by a close family friend. Antojos is written in dark red letters, made to look like they're covered in and dripping blood, just in time for Halloween. We sell things that you would expect from a corner store like this: candy, pan dulce, drinks, junk food, and our most famous product, piñatas. We hand make all of our piñatas, and it's my favorite part about working here. I love sitting in the back room, listening to music as I work. The smell of the glue is comforting in an odd way, and no one really bothers me back there. On slow days, I work on my own project. It's also a piñata, although this particular one is a bit different than the ones we sell in the shop. This one is an exact replica of a porcelain doll that I used to have when I was younger. It was gifted to me by my maternal grandmother when I turned 5. She claimed that the doll was supposed to give me good luck and ward off evil spirits and counteract any curses that someone might put on me. My grandmother was a big believer in witchcraft and would periodically cleanse the shop as well as all of our homes. She had a psychic that she visited frequently, and any time someone was wrong, her first thought was that someone had cursed us. I always thought she was a bit quirky, but her beliefs didn't really bother me. I didn't exactly believe everything that she said, but I did find witchcraft to be interesting and remember watching her do various cleanses as a child. I had named the doll Evelina. For years, I carried her around with me everywhere. It took my parents days to get me to stop crying over the fact that I wasn't allowed to take her with me to school. She was a rather large doll, about 1.5 feet tall, with curly black hair and brown skin with rosy cheeks and dark eyes. She wore a headband made of large roses on her head and wore a white and red floral dress with lacy sleeves and shiny black shoes. Evelina was stolen about a year ago. At the age of 23, I had grown out of the doll phase years prior and instead had put the doll in the store window along with the various other decorations displayed there. One day, a group of 12-year-olds from the neighborhood came into the store and stole handfuls of candy and snacks. One of them managed to sneak off with the doll, and they ran off before anyone could stop them. I knew the boy who had taken the doll. His name was Lucian, and he was known to play pranks and cause trouble in the neighborhood, but no one ever really did anything about it. His parents didn't care about his behavior, and calling the cops was no use either, as his own father was an officer and would simply get Lucian out of trouble. As a result, he ran rampant around the neighborhood, destroying property and stealing from the neighbors, and nobody could stop him. He had managed to steal from our shop 3 times now. The first 2 times he managed to only get away with small items like a bottle of Coke or a bag of chips. The most recent time was when he went for the doll. I remember the day clearly. I had been in the back room, finishing up a custom piñata when I heard a crash from the front of the store. Zachitl. I heard my uncle Ernesto call me from the front of the shop. I shot up and ran out of the back room, not even bothering to wash my hands of the glue first. As I stepped into the shop and past the various shelves of items, I saw Lucian and 3 other kids running down the street, cutting through traffic as the drivers honked at them, screeching to a halt. I turned back to Ernesto as he silently cursed at the kids while he began to pick up some items that had fallen in the commotion. "What did they take?" I asked, making sure not to touch anything. "They took the doll. I'm so sorry, Midja," he replied. I looked at the display in front of the window, at the empty spot where the doll used to sit. I sighed in frustration. Why do we keep letting him in the store? You know he's going to do the same thing over and over. Ernesto finished picking up the items and rearranging the display, and then he turned to look at me, patting my head as he frowned. "Your parents already tried that," he replied. "This is insane. Someone should do something. He stole my doll. Do you know how long I've had that?" Ernesto simply glanced at me as he walked back behind a counter, grabbing a broom to start sweeping the front of the shop. I stood there, looking down the street in the direction that Lucian had gone. He was long gone. I couldn't even see him in the distance anymore. I was sad as I thought about what he was going to do to the doll. He would most likely get rid of it or trash it, and I tried not to cry. I felt a bit silly, being so upset over a doll at my age, but all I could do was remember all the memories of the doll and how important it was to me. After a while, I retreated to the back room and began working on my own project. When I told my grandmother that someone had stolen the doll, she hugged me for about 3 minutes while she stroked my hair and whispered a prayer under her breath. It took me about 2 months to fully finish the piñata, but once it was done and painted, I hung it up in the back room to admire my work. It was an exact replica of the doll, only a lot larger, and made of paper mache. I had used black tissue papers, folded carefully, and then unfolded to look like strands of curly hair. I had hand-painted the floral pattern on her dress, along with her facial features. Once I was done, I showed it to my grandmother, who, to my surprise, was not happy to see it. "What's wrong?" I asked, looking at her as she pressed her lips together and narrowed her eyes, shaking her head slowly. "I don't think you should have made this," she replied, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "What are you talking about? It looks just like the doll you gave me." "Yes, but it is not the doll. This is something else entirely." "I know it's not the doll is gone," I said as she continued to examine the doll. I watched as she reached out and touched the piñata's arm with her fingertips, snatching them as if she had been burned. "What?" I asked. "What did you make this with?" she asked. "Paper, glue, paint." "No," she cut me off. "You made it with anger." I said nothing, looking from her to the piñata, starting to feel unsettled. The more I stared at the piñata, the creepier it looked. "I can feel it," she whispered, leaning forward as she continued to study the piñata. "What are you talking about?" I snapped, taking the piñata and hanging it by a hook on the wall. "You should get rid of it," she said. "What?" "I'm not getting rid of it. It took me hours to make." My grandmother glanced at the piñata once again and shrugged. "Fine, but don't say that I didn't warn you." I avoided my grandmother for a while after that, which was pretty easy to do as she went on vacation to Mexico shortly after. With her gone, I took the piñata out of the back room and carried it into the shop. My cousin Alejandro stood behind the register, giving a customer their change when I walked out. He turned to look at me as the customer left. "Hey Sosie," he greeted me, using the nickname he had created for me when he was a toddler shifts, and I eventually forgot about the whole thing when I left the shop that evening. The following day, I went into the shop for my shift in the afternoon. As I rounded the corner, I spotted the piñata standing outside the shop. Annoyed, I picked up the piñata and brought it with me into the shop. Ernesto was already there, restocking some items as I stepped inside. "Good morning," he said when he saw me. "Why was this outside?" I asked. Ernest turned to glance at the piñata and shrugged. "I don't know." "Who put it out there?" I asked. "I don't know," he repeated. "Well, you're the only one here." He gave me a look, peering at me over the top of his glasses and raising his eyebrows in a questioning look. I said nothing, not wanting to start an argument, and simply put the piñata back in its spot. At 3:30, Ernesto closed the shop to go out for lunch, and I stayed behind, deciding to have a Coke and a muffin instead, and I sat in the back room on my phone as I ate. A few minutes after Ernesto left, I heard a soft thud come from the front of the store. I froze, listening. It was all quiet for a few seconds before the screams erupted. I jumped up and ran towards the front of the store to find a group of kids running away from the store. They looked about 8 years old and had backpacks on, so I assumed it was just some kids walking home from school. I turned around to go back to my food, but that's when I noticed the piñata. It had been moved once again, and this time it stood right in front of the glass doors, facing the street. Confused, I looked around the shop to see if Ernesto had come back and was messing with me, but I was alone, and the door was still locked. I knew for a fact that the piñata was still hanging up in its spot when Ernesto left, and I knew that I hadn't moved it, so how had it gotten to the front of the store? I grabbed the piñata and once again put it in its spot. As I backed away to get a better look, I felt like I was being watched. I walked from one side of the store to the other, and the piñata's eyes followed me whichever way I went. I got chills as I stared at it, and it stared back. I thought back to what my grandmother had said about how I had made the piñata with hate and how I should have gotten rid of it. Maybe she was right. I decided to take it down and put it in the back room, at least until my grandmother came back and I could ask her what to do. When my family members asked me why I had moved the piñata, I simply told them that I didn't want anyone to steal it. It was a good excuse, and they didn't question me any further. Moving it didn't solve the problem though. Every time I went into the back room, the piñata was in a different spot. I would somehow move from the hook on the wall to one of the chairs in the room. I started moving it any time I went into the room to work, turning it around to face the wall. I felt weird having it face me like it was watching me for some reason. If I left the room, however, I would come back and find it once again facing my seat. I began to suspect that the piñata was haunted, and my suspicions were confirmed when I opened the store one morning to find all of the merchandise on the floor. The store was a mess, and there, in the middle of it all, was the damn piñata. It stood there, facing the door as if it knew that I would be coming in, and it wanted me to see it. It took me hours to clean everything up and put it in its place. After that, I managed to get my hands on some holy water, which I used on the piñata and sprayed around the shop. Nothing happened for the rest of that day, but the next day my mother broke her arm trying to grab some extra bags from the back room. She said she went in there to grab the bags and ended up tripping over the piñata and falling directly onto her arm. She swore that the piñata hadn't been there when she walked into the room and couldn't explain how she could have missed it if it had. I attempted to tell my parents that the piñata was haunted, but they didn't believe in any of that stuff and told me to stop being silly. It was just an accident. I was on high alert any time I was in the store, expecting something else to happen, perhaps something worse. 4 days went by after my mother's accident, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. On the 5th day, I was working with Alejandro again when he went into the back to bring out a piñata that a customer was coming to pick up later that day. A few seconds later, he screamed. I ran to the back room to see what had happened, and I found Alejandro standing in front of the table, looking into one of the buckets that we used to create the paper match mixture. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Look at this," he shouted. I walked over and looked into the bucket. I stared at the dark red liquid. "Is that blood?" "Yes." We backed up and looked at each other. "Who did that? Whose blood is it?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. I'm calling the cops." Alejandro left the room, and I stared down into the bucket, the smell of blood hitting me. I tried not to gag and backed away, picking up an old towel and throwing it over the bucket so I didn't have to look at it any longer. I glanced over at the piñata, my palm sweating as it stared back at me. The cops arrived shortly after, just to tell us that it was animal blood and not human blood in the bucket, and that it was probably just some dumb Halloween prank. They got rid of the bucket and Alejandro and I closed up the shop early that day. That night, I couldn't sleep, and so I got up in the middle of the night and drove down to the store. I had made up my mind, and I was going to get rid of piñata. The street was empty and dark, and the sound of the lock sliding out of place echoed through the night as I unlocked the door and stepped into the store. I turned on the lights, not wanting to be trapped in the dark with the piñata. I slowly made my way further into the store, looking around for anything that seemed out of place. I headed to the back room, pushing the door open and turning on that light as well. As I looked in the room, I noticed that the piñata wasn't in there. "Damn it," I whispered. I turned around and walked down every aisle in the shop. As I neared the refrigerators in the back, the piñata came flying through the air, headed right at me. I screamed as I fell to the floor, flinching as it crashed into a shelf, knocking down all of the bags of chips. I crawled away from the piñata as it lay on the ground, looking up towards the ceiling. I stood up, keeping my eyes on the piñata as I headed towards the door. As soon as I was up, the piñata was too, once again flying through the air, directly towards me. I ducked behind one of the shelves, and it crashed against the other side, shaking it and knocking down some of the items. I was a few feet again from the door and I began to crawl towards it once again when I heard the piñata begin to slide across the floor. I stopped, and it did too. I eyed the door, trying to decide if I would be able to make it outside before the piñata could knock me out or worse. As I debated this, I noticed 2 people approaching the store. One of them pressed their face against the glass, and I recognized Lucian. I waved him away with my hand, and he held up both his middle fingers in response, and then erupted in laughter as he pulled the doors open. "Get out!" I shouted, standing up. I didn't hear the piñata move, so I walked around the shelf to peek into the next aisle. "What's that?" he asked, speeding over to pick up the piñata. He laughed hysterically. "Look, Armando, she made a piñata to replace the doll." His friend laughed, standing right outside the shop as he held the door open. "Give it back," I said. I made no move to retrieve the piñata, however, scared that it might fly out of his hands or something. "Why? Do you miss your doll? Aren't you like 30? He asked. "Give it back to me, it's not yours. Besides, you already took the original." Blah, blah, blah. Lucian replied in a whiny, high-pitched voice. I sighed, annoyed. "It's haunted, you know. Do you want to own a haunted piñata?" "I'm gonna rip it apart anyway," he shrugged. I glanced at the piñata without saying anything. "You really think you're going to stop me from taking it just because you say it's haunted?" Lucian laughed. "It is," I replied. He glanced at Armando and smirked before throwing the piñata at him and pushing over a table before running out of the shop. I didn't even try to stop them. I simply stared out into the street as the two ran away, shouting and laughing as they disappeared down the road. I shut the door after a while and looked back at the mess in the shop. I didn't feel the least bit sorry about what might happen to Lucian and Armando for taking the piñata. I was just glad that I had finally gotten rid of it.